The first time I truly saw my son, I was 45 years old and he was naked. It wasn't a choice. It was an accident, a collision of circumstance, and the oppressive, suffocating heat of a Paradise Valley summer. But that single stolen moment burned away the soft, gauzy filter of motherhood I had looked through for 22 years. It incinerated the child I remembered and left in his place a stranger living in my house. And in doing so ignited a fuse that would snake its way through the sterile quiet of my life, threatening to detonate everything I thought I knew about myself, my loneliness, and the very nature of love. My name is Clara. On paper, my existence was a masterpiece of enviable success. I was the wife of Marcus Thorne, a titan of finance, a man who moved through the world with the unyielding certainty of a shark in open water. His ambition was a gravitational force that pulled everything toward him, money, respect, opportunities in far-flung cities. But it also pulled him away from me, leaving me in the beautiful, cavernous echo of his life. Our sprawling minimalist home with its gallery white walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Camelback Mountain was less a home than a monument to his achievements. It was a beautiful, empty museum where I was the sole silent curator of our shared existence, spending my days dusting memories I hadn't made and arranging furniture that was chosen for its aesthetic rather than its comfort. Marcus was a ghost in his own home, a phantom presence whose primary interaction with our world was through the glowing rectangles of his phone and laptop. He was physically there at the breakfast table, his thumb scrolling through market reports from Asia, his coffee growing cold beside him, but his mind was already in Shanghai or London. He was in bed beside me at night, the cool blue light of his screen painting a chasm between us, a digital wall more impenetrable than brick and mortar. For years I had accepted this reality. I played the role of the supportive, understanding wife, Mrs. Thorne, nodding along to talk of mergers and acquisitions, of which I understood little and cared even less. I smiled at charity galas, my hand on his arm, a perfect accessory to his perfect life. But each time the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, the silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was a physical weight, an active entity that pressed down on me, amplifying the hollow ache in my chest. Our son Owen was 22, and he was my quiet, unspoken rebellion against this gilded emptiness. He was the living antithesis of his father's world. We could have given him a life paved with legacy admissions and cushy internships leading to a corner office with a view. He had tried it for 2 years, wandering the hallowed halls of a prestigious East Coast university like a visitor in a foreign land, his eyes vacant with a boredom that pained me to see. Then one day he had walked away. He shed the future his father had designed for him like an ill-fitting suit and returned to the relentless sun of Arizona. He took a job at a local high-end organic farmer's market. It was a world of earth and sweat and tangible things, a universe away from the abstract figures on his father's spreadsheets. He labored his skin perpetually sun-kissed, his hands calloused from lifting crates of produce. He'd often come home for his lunch break, a silent ritual that had become my sanctuary. He'd enter through the side door, his t-shirt dark with sweat, his hair damp, and his presence would fill the kitchen with the scent of sunshine and soil, a fragrance so real it momentarily chased away the sterile perfume of my loneliness. Those midday breaks were quiet, often filled with nothing more than the clinking of silverware and the low, constant hum of the air conditioning. But his presence, solid, real, and uncomplicated, was a balm to my solitude. He was there in a way his father hadn't been for a decade. I would watch him eat, this beautiful young man with his father's determined jaw and my pensive eyes, and I'd feel a fierce, complicated love that was the only true anchor in my drifting, solitary life. That July, the Arizona heat was a predator. It stalked the valley, suffocating everything in its relentless, shimmering grip. The air itself felt heavy, a physical barrier you had to push through. The morning began as it always did with Marcus's departure. He was a blur of expensive cologne, and the rustle of papers, his kiss a brief, dry peck on my cheek that felt more like a formality than an intimacy. His mind had already boarded a flight to another time zone. The solid final click of the front door was a starting pistol for the day's loneliness. The house seemed to exhale its vast, open-plan spaces expanding with the quiet, and I was left to drift through the long, empty hours until Owen's return. I sat by the living room's picture window, which framed the desolate beauty of the desert landscape like a sterile painting. I watched the heat warp the air above the pristine flagstone patio, making the distant mountains tremble. The world outside looked like a watercolor painting left in the rain, its edges bleeding and indistinct. A familiar ache settled deep in my bones, a sorrow so constant it felt like a part of my own anatomy, an organ I didn't know how to live without. Just before noon, the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced his arrival. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent and immediate it was almost embarrassing. He came in through the side door that led to the kitchen, letting it bang shut behind him. His green work t-shirt was clinging to the lean, defined muscles of his back and shoulders, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with perspiration. "It's a furnace out there, Mom," he said, his voice a low murmur that was somehow soothing. He dropped a small paper bag filled with fresh, impossibly fragrant peaches onto the vast quartz island, their sweet scent momentarily cutting through the sterile air of the house. He pulled a bottle of chilled water from the sub-zero refrigerator, the condensation beating on its surface instantly, and twisted the cap off with a sigh. He slumped into a chair at the glass kitchen table across from me. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now that he was here. It was a shared, comfortable quiet, punctuated only by the whisper of the AC vents and the slow rhythmic drip of condensation from his water bottle onto the tabletop. We sat lost in our own thoughts while the sun beat down on the roof above. The heat wasn't just outside anymore. It felt like it was inside me, a stifling pressure building behind my ribs, a restlessness that demanded action. I decided a cool shower was the only answer, a desperate attempt to wash away the physical and emotional swelter of the day. "I'm going to go cool off," I announced to the quiet room. Owen just nodded, his attention on the patterns the water droplets were making on the table. As I walked up the floating staircase, my hand trailing along the cool metal rail, I felt a sense of release, of moving toward a small baptism. Halfway up, I heard the sound of running water from upstairs. I assumed it was the master bath, perhaps a faucet left dripping. But as I reached the landing, I realized the sound was coming from the guest bathroom at the far end of the hall, the bathroom Owen used. The door was slightly ajar, a soft sliver of warm light spilling onto the dark hardwood floor. Curiosity, or perhaps just a subconscious pull towards the only other soul in the house, made me drift closer. My bare feet made no sound on the polished wood. I told myself I was just going to close the door to preserve his privacy. But I hesitated. My hand hovered over the cool metal of the handle, and I peered through the gap, and my world tilted on its axis. It was Owen. He was under the powerful cascade of the rain shower, his back to me, entirely oblivious to my presence. And in that precise moment, the part of my brain that was a mother, the calm, rational, caregiving part, simply shut down. It was unplugged by a surge of something so foreign and overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. The boy I had raised, the one whose fevers I'd cooled with damp cloths, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose small hand I'd held crossing the street, was gone. He had been utterly and completely replaced by this man. He was tall, his frame lean but wired with the kind of dense functional muscle that comes from real labor. Water sluiced over his broad shoulders, charting glistening paths down the long, elegant curve of his spine, disappearing into the shadows below. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. I was paralyzed, a voyeur in my own home, witnessing a scene of profound and unintended intimacy that felt both sacred and profane. A different kind of heat flooded my body, a deep internal burn that had nothing to do with the summer sun. It was a bewildering flush of confusion, of acute shame, and a strange, unnameable flicker of something else, something dark and primal that I refused to identify. My mind was a maelstrom of conflicting commands. Look away. Turn around. This is your son, your child. But my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my gaze tracing the lines of his form, as if seeing a piece of classical sculpture for the first time, beautiful and remote and utterly forbidden. I finally managed to wrench myself backward, my movement clumsy and panicked. As I did, my hip knocked against a foam pool noodle someone had left leaning against the wall from a weekend swim. It fell, hitting the tiled floor with a hollow, echoing thwack that sounded like a gunshot in the tranquil stillness of the hallway. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The sound vibrated through the floor, through the soles of my feet, a blaring klaxon announcing my transgression. I fled. I didn't walk. I nearly sprinted down the hall and scrambled down the stairs, my hand pressed to my mouth, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I sank onto the edge of the living room couch, my body trembling desperately, trying to force the image from my mind. But it was seared onto the backs of my eyelids. The echo of the fallen noodle reverberated in my head, each pulse a drumbeat of dread. He heard. He must have heard. He'll know. A few minutes later, which felt like a torturous eternity, the sound of the shower upstairs stopped. The ensuing silence was heavier, more charged than before, thick with questions I couldn't answer. Then I heard his bedroom door click shut down the hall. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, but the release brought no relief. My thoughts kept spiraling back to that unguarded moment. Something had been unlocked in me, a dormant awareness of him as something other than my child, and I knew with a sickening certainty that the lock was broken for good. I was still sitting there, my head buried in my hands, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of my composure, when his voice cut through my turmoil. "Mom, you hear that noise a minute ago?" His tone was casual, unconcerned, pulling me from the wreckage of my thoughts with shocking normalcy. I looked up, my face feeling stiff and unnatural. Yes, I managed my own voice, thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. I just knocked something over in the hall. Sorry about that." I forced a brittle smile as he appeared in the doorway of the living room. His hair was damp and combed back, and he was wearing a clean t-shirt and shorts. He looked so young, so innocent, it made the chaos in my mind feel even more monstrous and depraved. He just shrugged, his expression open and untroubled. "No worries." He gave me a small, easy smile, and then disappeared back into his room, the click of his door once again sealing the house in silence. But my heart refused to be still. It beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs, trapped by the memory and the suffocating heat. "What is happening to you, Clara?" A wave of self-loathing washed over me, a nauseating cocktail of shame and terror. Something inside me had irrevocably shifted. The simple, sacred lens of motherhood had shattered, and I knew, with a sinking sense of doom, that I could never look at my own son the same way again. The next morning, the charade of normalcy resumed. Marcus sat at the breakfast table, his thumb flicking rhythmically across his phone screen, a general commanding his digital troops from the comfort of our kitchen. The storm raging inside me was entirely invisible to him, a tempest in a teacup he wouldn't have noticed anyway. I moved around the kitchen on autopilot, my hands placing plates and pouring coffee with a steadiness I did not feel. "Have to fly out to Shanghai this afternoon," he announced without looking up from his screen. "Deal's closing. Might be a week, could be 2. The familiar void opened up inside me a little wider this time, a little colder. Even after all these years, his casual departures felt like small abandonments, each one leaving me a little more adrift in the sea of our silent house. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything here." I said the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He gave me a quick, distracted smile, the kind one gives to a helpful assistant before grabbing his briefcase. "I know you will." The sound of the front door closing was a thunderclap in the quiet house. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was absolute, palpable. I looked across the table at Owen. He was stirring his coffee, his spoon, making slow, hypnotic circles in the black liquid. His eyes, when he finally lifted them to meet mine, held a profound weariness that seemed too old for his years, and something else a searching quality. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the vast room, "I'm taking the week off from the market. I was thinking, maybe we could just spend some time together. Just us." He hesitated, and in that small, vulnerable pause, I saw it all. "It's been a while." His voice was laced with a deep, resonant yearning that was a perfect, startling echo of my own. A genuine smile bloomed on my face, the first real expression I'd felt in days. The crushing tension in my shoulders eased. "I'd like that very much, honey." That afternoon, we sat in the living room, a space usually reserved for sterile entertaining, a room that felt more like a showroom than a place for living. But with Marcus gone, it felt like our own. A gentle breeze, a rare gift in the summer, billowed the sheer linen curtains, and shafts of golden sunlight streamed in, creating shifting, dancing patterns on the plush rug. "Mom," Owen began, and his voice held a new timbre, a depth and maturity that startled me. There's a lot I want to tell you." I turned to face him on the couch, giving him my entire undivided attention, hungry for the connection. "I'm listening." He started slowly telling me stories from the market. He painted vivid pictures with his words, describing the eccentric regulars, the finicky chefs from upscale restaurants, the time a whole crate of heirloom tomatoes had split open, sparking a frantic, laughing cleanup that stained his clothes red. A deep, rumbling laughter emerged from his chest as he told the stories, a sound I realized with a pang that I hadn't heard in years. I listened rapt, feeling the emotional distance that had grown between us begin to shrink with every shared word. His face lit up as he talked, and a pure, uncomplicated joy swelled in my chest. This was his life, the one he had chosen, and for the first time I could see the quiet contentment in him that had been so painfully absent during his university years. The hours melted away. Spurred on by his openness, I found myself opening up in return. I told him about my book club, my struggles with the roses in the garden, and then hesitantly I told him more. I told him about my old passion for painting, how I had a canvas set up in the spare room, an unfinished landscape of the Superstition Mountains that I hadn't touched in years. I described the colors I wanted to use, the feeling I wanted to capture, the loneliness of the desert at dusk. It was a small, quiet detail of my life, something that seemed insignificant next to Marcus's global stage. But Owen listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, truly seen for the first time in a very long time. "You've grown up so much, Owen," I murmured during a lull in the conversation. I felt a pang of maternal duty, a reflexive need to steer the conversation back to safer, more conventional shores. Have you thought about meeting someone?" He let out a soft chuckle, his eyes glinting with a familiar mischief that I hadn't seen since he was a boy. The girls who come to the market are mostly just trying to get free avocados. The room filled with our shared genuine laughter, and for a moment every barrier between us mother and son, the past, the future, completely dissolved. We were just two people connecting. The afternoon sun slanted low through the windows, bathing the room in a warm, honeyed glow. My own heart felt lighter, the hollow space inside me filled with a warmth that felt like understanding and affection. A peaceful quiet settled over us, but it wasn't the empty silence of before. It was a rich, intimate quiet, pregnant with unspoken things. It was then that his expression shifted. The laughter faded from his eyes, replaced by something serious and unwavering. He looked directly at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a touch, and his next question made the air freeze in my lungs. "Mom," he said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "Did you see me in the shower yesterday?" The words hung in the silent room like smoke from an extinguished flame. My heart, which had been so peaceful moments before, began to riot in my chest, a panicked, frantic thumping. A hot flush climbed my neck and flooded my face. My tongue felt thick and useless, my throat suddenly as dry as the desert outside. Owen's gaze never left mine. He was unnervingly patient, simply waiting, giving me the space to lie or tell the truth. Before I could stammer out a denial, a clumsy, transparent lie, he spoke again, his voice soft, but weighted with a devastating certainty. "I saw your shadow in the doorway." The admission hit me with the force of a physical blow, a wave of shame and panic so potent it made the room spin. He knew. He had known the entire time. He had watched me lie with my eyes and my flustered, clumsy apology. He had pretended not to notice, had allowed me to keep my secret, all while holding his own. I tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words were trapped, a logjam of guilt in my throat. Our eyes were locked, and the tension in the room became a living thing, thick and heavy, and humming with a strange, forbidden energy. Just as I was about to force some sound out to shatter the moment with an apology, he broke the silence one last time. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming impossibly gentle yet resolute. "I love you." He paused, and in that breath the entire world seemed to stop spinning, holding its breath with me. "And not just as a son. I love you as a person. The person you are when Dad isn't here. The person I just spent the entire afternoon with." His words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, beautiful and terrifying. But then they sank in each one, a stone dropping into the still deep well of my loneliness. My heart was a battlefield of warring emotions, shock, terror, and a wild, indefensible thrill that terrified me most of all because it felt so much like hope. Time stretched and became meaningless as his steadfast gaze held mine. "Owen!" I finally whispered, my voice a thread of sound, barely audible. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned across the small space separating us on the couch and took my hand. His touch was warm and firm, an anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. And then he shifted closer, his movement fluid and certain, and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight, almost desperate embrace. In that instant, every defense I had ever built, every rule of right and wrong, every maternal instinct simply evaporated. They were burned away by the stunning, overwhelming force of this connection. This was what I had been starving for. This raw, unconditional, terrifying intimacy. His arms were strong and solid around my waist, his head buried in the curve of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. And my own arms came up as if with a will of their own, holding him just as tightly, my fingers digging into the fabric of his t-shirt. The sterile, silent house had become the epicenter of a storm of unspoken feeling, and I was in its eye holding my son, and knowing with a terrible, exhilarating certainty that I never wanted to let go. The human heart is not a logical organ. It does not obey the tidy rules we write for society or the roles we are assigned to play. Emotional starvation is a powerful driving hunger, and when a soul is desperate enough, it can mistake any offered warmth for the sun, any temporary shelter for a permanent home. If this journey into the fragile and dangerous boundaries of love resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories that dare to explore the complex, messy truth of human emotion. Sometimes the greatest transformations don't begin with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet confession in a sunlit room, a moment where two lonely people find a beautiful and perhaps devastating refuge in one another.